Welcome to the SIG Autoscaling breakout session. If you are part of SIG Autoscaling, if you contribute, then please come up to the stage. Then we have a few more, thank you, a few more heads here. And the rest is essentially Q&A, right? So if you have a question, probably I'm going to run around with that microphone for people to ask, and if we can use your microphone for answering things. So Q&A, you can ask anything related to autoscaling. Who has a question? First question.
Hi. I would like to autoscale a CRD that has a scale sub-resource, but it's not connected to any pod. It's like an external. So how would I would like to use all the logic about the HPA, the horizontal pod autoscaler, using metrics, custom metrics, things like that, and then scale out and in this custom resource. But the HPA is, well, like the name suggests, like very, it's really about pods, right? But so would it be possible to make it more generic?
So that's not possible right now, mainly because the HPA has a lot of logic around detecting pods that are in weird states that we don't want to skew your autoscaling for normal use cases, but it's definitely a use case that has been brought up before, and it's something we're interested in. This is kind of the part where I go, PR is welcome. Like, I would love to see a good design for how we can move some of that logic around detecting pods that would throw things off to a more generic form, or continue to support that logic while being a little bit more flexible in the case where our scale sub-resource doesn't provide a pod selector, for instance.
Hi, is there any plan on making thresholds for autoscaling? So instead of having 1, we could have like minimum, maximum. I've been playing with the tolerance in the controller, and sometimes 10% is not enough. Do you plan on having flexibility there? Okay, so to clarify, you want to configure the amount by which it scales up in steps, or like. So for a summary, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, the way the horizontal pod autoscaler works right now, in kind of the high-level overview, is that we get a current utilization, we compare that to the target utilization, forming a ratio, and then we multiply that ratio by the current replicas. So if your target is 500 millicores and you're using a whole 1 core, 1,000 over 500 is 2, so we multiply the current replica count by 2. And then same in the opposite direction, right? If you're actually only using 250, 250 over 500 is a half, so we multiply the current by half. So to clarify, so right now we have a thing where like we only will scale up at once by a certain amount, so that we don't quickly add 500 replicas to your thing, and then it turns out that it was some sort of weird spike, and we really should only have added 10. So are you looking to configure that threshold, or are you looking for something just closer to, I want to scale at particular triggers? Yeah, the latter. So basically, if I trigger at 500 millicores and I have 501, it won't trigger because it's in the 10% tolerance. I'd like to know if it's possible to have instead like 600 and 400. So like a scope under which I don't want to scale.
Oh, okay, I see. That would be a good thing to have. We don't have it right now. But again, like some of this stuff is we tried to cover some of the common cases that people were encountering, and as we learn more about what people need to do with the horizontal pod autoscaler, we are open to more designs to improve it.
Cool. Thank you.
Sounds like it's worth it to raise an issue for that.
And also, like, if you can put up a design proposal or something, that would be even better. One of the things we always try to balance is we don't want to make things too crazy complicated, right? Like, we want to make it so that you can understand, most people can understand the horizontal pod autoscaler, but it's flexible enough for people to do what they need to with it.
As someone who uses the cluster autoscaler a lot, is there anything on the roadmap there that you can talk about? Maybe more nodes?
So the big thing with the cluster autoscaler coming up that I know of, so that's not quite my area of focus, but I try to keep an eye on everything that's going on in SIG Autoscaling. The big thing coming up is integration with the cluster API. So we're looking at integrating with the cluster API to avoid our current dependency on like manually knowing how to interact with your cloud provider, because maintaining cloud providers for everyone is a pain in the butt. And we would love to be able to just say, if you implement the cluster API, then we work with you. And even if you have your own particular implementation that's proprietary or whatever.
Is there anything in particular you would like to see, or was it just general interest in the roadmap?
Currently, it taps out at 1,000 nodes for various performance reasons. Would love to see that go up.
Okay. All right. I'll definitely make sure we pass that on. But okay, cool.
Sorry, could you raise your hand?
So do you actually see that it stops working for you after 1,000 nodes? Because so the 1,000 nodes threshold is something that has been tested, and this is what we know works. But if you've seen things that stop working after 1,000 nodes, we'd love to know. Like, we haven't observed yet anything concrete that starts breaking after this threshold. So. Okay.
Couple of questions. Is there a simulator where we can, without having to spin up a lot of nodes, test the different autoscalers?
So I can say for vertical pod autoscaler, you can try it out using an off mode, which just generates the recommendations. So you can take a look at what it would do to your pods. For cluster autoscaler, I'm not aware of anything.
Yeah. Well, hopefully when we move to the cluster API, you'll be able to do a fake cluster API implementation. And then for the horizontal pod autoscaler, you could probably run with a fake node, like a kind of a fake node thing that accepted pods and marked them as if they were running. We have a similar testing framework inside Kubernetes for doing certain types of performance testing. And then you can provide a fake implementation of the resource metrics API, which I think we have floating around somewhere. If it's not an official repository, I'll make sure it gets out somewhere.
Okay, and secondly, is anybody using a project backlasting called Escalator for autoscaling?
Can you repeat that?
Escalator.
I am not aware.
Just a quick question: Who would be interested in such a simulator? Who would want to use such a simulator? Just to gauge the interest a bit. Okay.
Cool.
Maybe that's something. Not anymore. You. Oh, sorry.
Hi. Is there a timeline for when Autoscaler will start using the cluster API?
I don't know of a timeline. Do you have one?
So I don't have the timeline, but there is one big problem currently with the cluster API that is being worked out between the autoscaling team and the team working on the cluster API. Namely, what the autoscaler needs, it needs to be able to delete a concrete machine. Like, this machine, this is the one that I want to delete, and this is currently not incorporated in the cluster API, and without that, the scale down doesn't work. So in the current implementation, in the current design of cluster API, we can only do scale up, and scale down would be impossible, and scale down is pretty important. So so basically, we're trying to figure out how it would be possible to integrate what cluster autoscaler needs and not complicate the cluster API. So unfortunately, I don't have any concrete plans for you, but this is the status of where it's currently at.
My guess would be not 2018.
Is there a way with the cluster autoscaler to tell it that a node group can be scaled down but should never be scaled up, like for upgrades, for example?
Can you repeat?
To tell the cluster autoscaler that a certain node group may be scaled down if nodes are idle, but that group should never be scaled up. So you can
Well, that's a
migrate
use
off
case
legacy
that I
nodes.
haven't seen. So I don't believe it's possible at the moment. I guess you can try filing an issue or try the Slack channel
Okay.
for SIG Autoscaling, and they'll definitely know if it's possible and if it's easily added if it's not there.
Okay.
Hey, Mike, can I ask a question? Sure. All right, cool. So maybe a question for the group as well. So any thoughts around creating higher level constructs to manage the performance of a group of pods all together based on one metric that would just make it easier rather than creating multiple autoscaling rules, each per pod or namespace per I would say per controller. It would be one construct for all of these. So for example, I have a HTTP endpoint, and that HTTP endpoint is basically served by multiple pods. Right, and I would like all of these to be scaled up or down altogether based on that custom metric. So rather than going and creating a rule for each one of them, I can just group them all together as one app, one logical app, and they all get scaled up and down together.
So you could probably do something similar. So it basically comes down, you can point the horizontal pod autoscaler at anything that eventually resolves to pods and has a label selector, right? So anything that implements the scale sub-resource and can provide that label selector to select its pods. So you could hypothetically implement some sort of higher level grouping, and your metric in the horizontal pod autoscaler also, as of the past few releases, does not have to be a per pod metric too. So like if you are measuring your requests per second at your load balancer level, and you're not for some reason splitting that up per pod, you can specify what we call an object metric or an external metric, which is basically saying I have a single metric that corresponds to some object, or I have a single metric that corresponds to some set of labels inside my metric storage solution.
Sure. I have two questions around the cluster autoscaler. I'll keep them short. The first one is that currently the cluster autoscaler can be configured in autoscaling groups by using tags on them, but in GCE it uses a prefix on the name of the managed instance group. Is there any context on that decision, or will in GCE we be able to filter on labels anytime soon?
I'm not aware of any changes around the GCE cloud provider for cluster autoscaler. It might be on the roadmap. I might not be aware of everything, so I encourage you to file an issue on GitHub to find out.
When in doubt, always file an issue, or even better, a pull request or design proposal.
The scale-up delay has disappeared. Are there any plans for the scale-down delay to make it more granular so that I can select per HPA definition on the minute where the scale-down should happen?
We don't actually have a scale-down delay either, anymore. Right now what we do is we kind of look at a window of values and we pick the largest one during that window. So in some senses, it continues, in some cases, it continues to behave a bit like a delay, but in other cases, it will smooth out bumps. Right now, I don't know of any plans to configure that window, but it's certainly something we could consider.
All right, with that, we reached the top of the hour and unfortunately we're already done. But I'd really like to know if that format in terms of Q&A and so on, if that's something useful or if you prefer more traditional like deep dive coverage. And yeah, definitely file issues and be around on the Slack channel and in our Zoom meetings. Thanks a lot for being here. Cheers.